Were you aware that Kentucky has one of the highest levels of tree diversity in the entire United States? It's true. We have over 120 species of trees that call the state home. And while we have an incredibly diverse and healthy population, they are not without threat. They are constantly under attack from invasive species. Some of those species may be plants, some of them insects, while others may be pathogens. And we're going to talk today, and I'm not going to give you an exhaustive, complete list of invasive species that are threatening our tree population, but we're going to hit some of the ones that are on researchers' radar currently. Now, some of the threats I mentioned come from within their own. There are other plants that threaten our tree species. One of the ones that we see often is a vine known as winter creeper, and another vine known as kudzu. Now, these two vines are similar in that they both can either cover the ground or they can grow up and over trees. As a ground cover, they prevent saplings from being able to take root. They can choke out wildflower species. But as they climb up young trees, they can actually cause those trees to be stunted or even killed because they restrict sunlight from reaching that tree and being able to grow and flourish. A couple of trees or shrubs that we often see that compete in similar ways are Ailanthus, or tree of heaven as it's known, and then bush honeysuckle. Ailanthus is a tree that can grow incredibly quickly. It is often one of the very first things to take root in a disturbed area. And because it grows so quickly and so effectively that it outcompetes native tree species and plant species for resources. It also engages in a type of chemical warfare called allelopathy. And basically what this means is that parts of the tree, including the leaves and the roots, contain a chemical that actually prevents other species from being able to grow in the area around it, or it can slow them down at the very least. Now, bush honeysuckle is very similar in that it grows incredibly quickly and it uses up resources before other species can. It's not as tall as Ailanthus is, but what we see is it grows around the edges of forests and disturbed areas, and it can prevent light from reaching the understory around those edges. It outcompetes, like I said, and steals nutrients. It actually is an incredibly efficient invasive. It's one of the very, very first things to leaf out in the late winter, early spring, and it's one of the last plants to still have berries on it in the year. So it extends its growing period beyond what other plants do, making it even more able to use those nutrients during that time period. It also uses allelopathic chemicals to be able to prevent other plants and trees from being able to grow in its vicinity. Now, there are plenty of other plant species that we could worry about, but let's move on to some insects that have been of particular concern over the last several years. The first one, if you at some point several years ago traveled on any of our state highways or interstates, you probably remember seeing purple triangular box traps hanging on trees along the road corridors, and those were used to track the spread of an insect known as the emerald ash borer. The emerald ash borer is a dark metallic green beetle. Adults feed on the leaves of ash trees while their larvae burrow into the bark and actually feed under the bark, and by doing so they destroy the tree's ability to transmit nutrients from the roots to the upper portion of the tree. And one of the very first signs you often see that an ash tree has been affected is that it dies from the top down. You see the top of the tree begin to die because it's actually preventing anything from traveling to that upper portion of the tree. This has actually resulted in the loss of hundreds of millions of trees and cost involved parties, local and state governments, and the timber industry millions of dollars in the process. Now, another insect that is a relatively large beetle, about 1.5 inches long, that we have not seen in Kentucky yet. But this is the Asian longhorned beetle, and it has been found in southeastern Ohio, so it will most likely be here in the near future. It actually affects trees in a similar way that the emerald ash borer does. The larvae burrow into the tree and feed, causing the tree to die. It affects maple tree populations. So far, we haven't seen it here, like I was saying, and the good news is we've learned a lot from our battle with the emerald ash borer, that researchers think that it's possible to slow down and mitigate the losses that are caused by the Asian longhorned beetle when it inevitably makes it to Kentucky. Now, another one that we have not seen in Kentucky yet, and this is one that would have a huge impact on our commercial timber industry, on possibly the fruit industry, and this is the spotted lanternfly. And if you've heard of this, it's a striking and almost beautiful insect that belongs to Hemiptera, which are true bugs, and it feeds on over 70 plant species, including many important commercially important fruit trees, and hardwoods such as walnut. Now, it literally sucks the life out of these trees, and it can cause them to be more susceptible to other diseases. But something else it does is it causes a sooty mold to grow on these trees. And the way it does that is these bugs, they exude a honeydew that drips from them and can get on the leaves of the plant that they're feeding on, or the bark. And it can actually cause the tree to be able to photosynthesize a little less effectively by covering their leaves. And it isn't likely to kill the tree on its own, but it is likely to make the tree more susceptible to other illnesses and other invasive species. So it's definitely something to keep your eye out for. And like I said, it's not been found in Kentucky yet. It is thought to be inevitable. It will be here eventually. So researchers are definitely keeping their eye on the movement of it. Now, I mentioned that a pathogen can also be a threat to a tree, and what we're seeing right now in just a handful of counties is something that's known as Laurel wilt disease. And Laurel wilt disease is kind of a 1-2 invasive species punch. What it is it's caused by a fungus, but this fungus is transported by an invasive beetle known as the Redbay Ambrosia beetle. And this beetle feeds on our native spicebush and sassafras trees. Now, the insect itself isn't terribly damaging, but the fungus that hitches a ride along with it is killing those trees. And as of right now, there is no cure, there is no treatment for these trees. The only thing that is being done right now is if infected trees are discovered, they are to be cut down, mulched, and then burned to prevent the spread any further than it already is. This video can kind of sound like a downer. We've talked about a lot of things that are really threatening our trees, and it can feel overwhelming. But there are things that we can do as citizens. One of the most important things you can do is just to be observant. Look for changes in the trees around your home. If you notice that trees are starting to look sick, be familiar with the species of trees that these insects and pathogens are attacking. And watch those trees specifically. Educate yourself on how these things spread, what trees that they affect. Another thing that's huge that we can do as citizens is to not move firewood. The way that a lot of these diseases and insects have spread is through the movement of firewood from people who are on vacation, or timber products moved from state to state for industrial purposes. So if you're going to need firewood somewhere where you're hiking or camping, please cut it there when appropriate. Find out the rules from where you're going to be staying and if it's appropriate to gather firewood, or buy it from a local supplier who has sourced it locally if possible. Another thing you can do when you're landscaping around your home, choose native plants. Native plants, because they grew up around the trees that we have here already, they are much better at coexisting, and they're less likely to cause any kind of threats to our native tree species. One of the things you can do is to contact your local extension office. If you have any questions or any concerns, you have any reason to believe that you have trees that are being affected by any of the things that we've mentioned here before, contact your extension office and ask them. They'll be more than happy to provide you with information, or if necessary, contact information for other organizations that are much more prepared to handle the threats that you're seeing in your area. I will drop a couple of links down below for websites where you can get more information, learn more about some of these things. I will also include contact information for Alexandra Blevins, who's the Kentucky Department of Forestry's Forestry Health Specialist. And particularly for the insect species that we mentioned here, she would be a good person to contact if you believe you have seen one of these species that are not here yet, but we expect to be. So anyways, I'm glad we had this opportunity today to talk about trees and some of the threats that we're seeing for them. We do have an incredibly healthy population, and I don't want to sound like I'm trying to scare you. I just feel like we need to be aware of these things so that the forest around us that we've grown to love and appreciate, that we can see those and we can pass those down as a legacy to our children and grandchildren. So keep your eyes open, educate yourself, and enjoy the trees.